Thank you. So, Besant Theosophy and academic bias is the theme, and I wanted to go directly into those points from Muriel's biography, Annie Besant, Struggles and Quest. As she mentioned, she speculated on several possible causes for the relative obscurity into which Besant has fallen in the decades since her death in 1933. And this, of course, is the cover of the new book. These items include a misunderstanding or lack of understanding of her quote-unquote conversion to Theosophy. Second, an underestimation of the scope of the late Victorian spiritual and occult revival. Third, her having been a woman who worked and fought alongside a number of talented men in a spirit of brotherhood, but whose memory has often eclipsed that of their female comrade. I should mention these are direct quotations from Muriel's book. Minimization, this is the fourth point, minimization of her role as a British woman doing political work in India because of what Muriel calls, an understandable climate of post-colonial guilt that makes her an embarrassment to some Western historians. And then finally, her having become a victim of trends in historical research that increasingly favor highly specialized and circumscribed studies. At the very least, this is a comprehensive list of potential pitfalls in Besant research and should be a warning to all who come after. It may also provide a useful set of lenses for reevaluating what has come before. Let us define academic bias in the realm of historiography as a lack of neutrality in research and writing that results in an intentional or unrecognized promotion of personal views on the subject. Such bias may over or underestimate the importance of the subject or specific aspects of it to influence scholarly and public opinion. In the case of historic personalities such as Besant, bias can range from the overestimation of quasi-hagiographies of special interest groups, such as the Theosophical Society, to the minimization resulting from outright dismissal, token interest, or tacit suppression. It is not the purpose of this paper to provide an in-depth examination of academic bias against Annie Besant or aspects of her work in previously published studies. Instead, I propose to provide examples that not only affirm the importance of Pecquestany-Bozier's formulation of these problems, but also to refine somewhat her presentation of the issues. I also suggest ways to prevent academic bias against Besant in future scholarship with a series of calls to mindfulness, one for each of Pecquestany-Bozier's points, which I have reformulated slightly as follows. Besant's quote-unquote conversion to Theosophy, past and present attitudes towards occultism, eclipse by male counterparts, Besant's involvement in Indian politics versus present-day post-colonial guilt, and over-specialization in academic research and writing. Today, I deal with points 1, 2, and 3. My first call to mindfulness concerns Besant's quote-unquote conversion to Theosophy in 1889 and her previous serial adherence to conventional religion, agnosticism, and atheism. Pecquestany-Bozier notes that for Arthur H. Nethercott, Besant's first truly documentary biographer, writing some 30 years after her death, and for Ann Taylor, who wrote the last major biography published nearly 25 years ago, Besant's, quote, conversion to Theosophy is described as yet another fracture in a life thought by these two authors to be fragmented to the point of incoherence. I suggest that the problem noted here is a result of the word conversion itself. If we trace it to its roots, it simply means turning toward. But if we examine its usage in religious and social contexts, we cannot fail to notice that it describes a personal event that is welcomed with joy by the sector faction to which conversion is made, anger by the sector faction that lost the convert, and skepticism or ridicule by so-called neutral observers. Certainly this was true in Besant's case, when H.P. Blavatsky crowed over Besant's having joined the Theosophical Society, TS. The National Secular Society fumed over it, and the press puzzled or joked over it. And these attitudes persist in later writers, depending on their orientation. Witness the hagiographies of writers within the TS, the overt or implied condemnations of writers who approved of her political and social work, but not her theosophical work, and the supposedly neutral skeptical scoffers, such as Nethercott, who present Besant's life as a pilgrim's progress of fantastical human folly. Despite William James's philosophical treatment of conversion and the varieties of religious experience, it seems that the word conversion cannot be used without in some way reflecting the bias of the writer, whether with or against the subject, or by observing the subject with suspect neutrality. Carol Hanbury Mackay attempted a seemingly brilliant intervention in the discourse about Besant's conversion by introducing the notion of deconversion, a radical turning away from the system of beliefs and values to which one had been previously converted. Thus Mackay speaks of Besant's quest as, quote, a narrative of crisis, deconversion, and conversion. Mackay borrowed the term deconversion from John D. Barbour, who used it to describe a sequence of 4 stages in the loss of religious faith: intellectual doubt, moral criticism, emotional suffering, and disaffiliation from community. To these, Mackay added the possibility that conversion and deconversion might alternate, a dynamic of turning toward and turning away that, in her words, might well be repeated, leading to increasingly larger and more encompassing belief systems. Thus, Besant's modus operandi was to, quote, convert in reverse fashion through a series of deconstructions, backing her way out of restrictive dogmas into more inclusive belief systems. That's Mackay. Though thoroughly contextualized, Mackay's construction of the trajectory of Besant's spiritual life does not address the popular perception that conversion is a form of psychological weakness, and it is exactly this bias against conversion that comes through in biographies of Besant written during her lifetime, such as those by Geoffrey West, pseudonym for Geoffrey Harry Wells, and Gertrude Williams, and those written after her death, such as Nethercott's and Taylor's. Of course, the word conversion can be properly used when citing interchanges of Besant's contemporaries on the various evolutionary stages of her thought. But as historians, we should perhaps be circumspect about carrying it into present-day discourse without a great deal of contextualizing. Perhaps we need a new model for describing the stages of spiritual growth, one that is free of unrecognized religious, popular, and intellectual bias. Such a model could be provided by a 5-stage theory of positive disintegration originated by Polish psychologist Kazimierz Dabrowski. Dabrowski studied individuals who had passed through periods of extreme psychological distress into periods of higher functioning characterized by inner peace and outer purpose. The 5 stages of positive disintegration and their correspondence to Besant's life may be described as follows. Primary integration: the individual is happily embedded in convention, and that would be Besant's childhood until her marriage, 1847 to 67. Second stage, unilevel disintegration. Psychological shocks result in existential crisis and the possibility of suicide. Besant's abusive husband, the serious illness of her daughter, her thoughts of suicide by chloroform, 1867 to 71. Third stage, spontaneous multi-level disintegration. Internal and external events seem to conspire in ejecting the individual involuntarily, i.e. spontaneously, from the state of being happily embedded in convention. This corresponds to Besant's work for the poor in Sibsi, her debilitating headaches, sleeplessness and exhaustion, and eventually her visit to Dr. Pusey, all from 1872. The fourth stage is called directed multi-level disintegration. The individual seeks intentionally to break down the constraints of convention on thought, feeling, and action in every area of life. This would be Besant's refusing communion, leaving her husband, beginning to write and lecture for free thought, 1872 to 74. And this continues, actually, until her so-called conversion to Theosophy, although there are several episodes, such as socialism, that intervene. And then finally, there is a stage called secondary integration. A new sense of wholeness develops, free from the limitations of convention, more self-determining, with greater possibilities of action, and a higher degree of tranquility and happiness. And this would involve Besant's moving, as she said herself, from storm to peace upon joining the Theosophical Society. I fully document the outer and inner events associated with these stages, often in Besant's own words. In Dabrowski's model, Besant's progression from atheism into secularism, socialism, and theosophy corresponds to several attempts to achieve secondary integration, each of which, until the last, dissolves again into the previous stage of directed multi-level disintegration. I offer this abbreviated consideration of Dabrowski's theory of positive disintegration not as a demonstration of its scientific validity, which may be subject to methodological challenges, but rather as a narrative structure that is free of the problems I identified with the word conversion. It could similarly be useful when we might wish to distance ourselves from popular narrative constructs such as the so-called archetypal heroes or heroines quest, or the academic construct of the male or female quest, since it is effectively gender neutral. Let us now turn to the second problem delineated by Pecquestin-Bazière, underestimation of the scope of the late Victorian spiritual and occult revival, which I have relabeled past and present attitudes toward occultism. Such underestimation may be a result of lack of interest in or empathy with the subject, lack of orientation to the territory, or lack of access to resources. In all cases, the problem may be reduced to what I call the insider-outsider dynamic, a simplified version of the emic-etic approach to field research adopted by cultural anthropologists, in which emic refers to the perspective of the subject and etic refers to the perspective of the observer. In the present discussion, there are two insiders, each with its own preoccupations and conversations, members of the TS on one side and academic researchers on the other. And there are two outsiders, academics as observed by TS members and TS members as observed by academics. Traditionally, the boundary between these two pairs of insiders and outsiders has been fraught with skepticism and non-cooperation, one example of which was the experience of academic Gregory Tillett, as described in his 1982 publication, The Elder Brother, a biography of Charles Webster Leadbeater. Calling himself a clairvoyant, Leadbeater was a highly controversial figure in the history of the TS. While researching his subject, Tillett received threatening letters, sources were offered and snatched away, and possible informants were urged not to speak with him. However, some of those members of the Theosophical Society didn't like being told what to do and spoke with him anyway. Under the presidency of Tim Boyd, a greater policy of openness and cooperation with academic researchers has developed within the TS Adyar, but it is still necessary to consider the insider-outsider dynamic with respect to both sides. Most academic research focuses on the development of the TS in the latter 19th century and early 20th century, up to the deaths of Besant and Leadbeater in 1933 and 1934, respectively. Yet many TS organizations that trace their history back to Blavatsky's founding of the original Theosophical Society in New York in 1875 still exist, with their respective insider perspectives and, as with other bodies associated with spiritual beliefs and practices, a wish to be treated with respect by outsiders. The best such treatment develops when researchers adopt the emic from within perspective and when TS member scholars take the etic from without perspective. With these ideas in mind, we notice that Carol Hanbury Mackay calls Ann Taylor's biography, quote, a disappointment because of its lack of empathy for its subject, unquote. If empathy is shown, it applies only to the causes that Taylor deemed worthy of deep investigation. Besant's pre-theosophical work in the areas of atheism, secularism, and socialism. Certainly this is a case of academic bias against Besant's involvement in the theosophical movement, resulting from an insufficiently emic perspective. Though Arthur H. Sorry, I seem to have gotten off with one of the slides. Though Arthur H. Nethercott has done his homework in exhaustively documenting Besant's theosophical work and beliefs, he too suffers from a lack of empathy for his subject. As a Shavian scholar, he clings perhaps too much to the insider status associated with Shaw's predominantly male intellectual circle, which could only perceive Besant's theosophical activities as a wayward, amusing diversion. Of course, we've had a contrary opinion on that earlier, which it would be interesting to discuss further. The result was organizing his material as a sprawling two-volume conceit in which Besant's multiple careers were likened to the 9 lives of a cat, with a sidelong, grinning glance at her cherished belief in reincarnation. Once again, the perspective is insufficiently emic. Pecasteng-Bozier points an accusing finger at Taylor and Nethercott, claiming that they both suffer from gender-biased interpretations and prejudices as regards theosophy so strong as to impair these authors' reflective abilities. Now we're going to have to deal once again with George W. Foote, I'm afraid, and now you know what he looks like. I actually used the same quote that was discussed by Dr. Muriel earlier. G.W. Foote, Besant's contemporary and for a time comrade in the National Secular Society, seems to have set the tone for such bias. In 1889, Foote opposed Besant's, quote, conversion to Theosophy, unquote, in a highly critical pamphlet, Mrs. Besant's Theosophy. Now, I hope you will appreciate the fact of having heard this quotation in a female voice and now in a male voice. Though he admired Mrs. Besant's eloquence and abilities, and still more her generous and enthusiastic character, and called her a brave as well as a good woman, he was concerned that Mrs. Besant might lead free thinkers astray. Why? Because while audiences chiefly consist of men, a lady speaker will exercise an influence out of all proportion to her intellect and information. For difference of sex tells unconsciously, and from the lips of a woman, especially if young or engaging, even commonplaces are apt to pass with men as revelations, and faulty logic is wonderfully convincing. Scholars such as Nethercott and Taylor may also have wanted to minimize Besant's oratorical influence. Mackay offers a possible explanation for their lack of neutrality and empathy, their inability to adopt the emic perspective. To read Besant's texts closely is to run the risk of being radicalized, maybe even converted to a secession of her belief systems, culminating with her grand vision for the future of the human race. The line of resistance to her siren song seems to have taken the form of personal attack and disparagement, chiefly through the charge of innuendo that she was easily swayed by others and always, quote, needed a man in her life, unquote. Hence, bias in writers such as Taylor and Nethercott may be a result, in Mackay's words, of their own efforts to resist the strength of her arguments and the potency of her rhetoric. However, the problem may not merely be the effect of Besant's cogent reasoning and persuasive rhetoric. It may also be a result of fear of damage to one's academic reputation if one seems to be overly sympathetic. On several occasions, I have encountered academics researching the late 19th and early 20th century fascination with spiritualism, theosophy, and the occult, who have told me that despite their sympathy for some aspects of the theosophical movement, they dare not join the Theosophical Society for fear of ruining credibility among their peers. The problem of lack of orientation to the territory shows itself when academic scholars rely too exclusively on the etic outsider formulations of other academic scholars in their accounts of TS history. Depending on the scholarly status and authority of their authors, such formulations may seem trustworthy, yet they are often limited by the depth of research undertaken. If I pick up such a study and do not find within it a rich bibliography of documents produced within the movement itself, I remain skeptical of its value. Thus, for me, the most compelling and trustworthy histories are likely to be those written by researchers who take the emic stance of cultural anthropologists and immerse themselves in primary resources driven by their interest in and empathy for the subject. Joy Dickson is such a researcher. As a theosophist, I can read her book, Divine Feminine Theosophy and Feminism in England, and find little to fault in her presentation of the TS, and much to expand my understanding of the historical context of the organization within local, political, and social developments. Her secret is that she deeply studied the Vahan, the monthly journal of the Theosophical Society in England and Wales, started by Blavatsky in 1891, shortly before her death, as a bi-monthly, and continuing with a couple changes of name until 1925. Listening in on the conversations of long-dead theosophists on the spiritual and political subjects that preoccupied them, Dickson developed the necessary empathy, which, combined with a methodology informed by gender theory and women's studies, resulted in one of the most complete and compelling histories of the TS I have encountered. However, her empathy did not lie with TS members as such, but with women embedded within and limited by a male-dominated society who happened to be TS members. Thus, empathy for and academic neutrality toward her subjects could be maintained with little possibility of her being accused of the cardinal sin of ethnography going native. Another aspect of lack of orientation to the territory involves the recondite history of the TS, which can sometimes seem as histrionic, fraught, and needlessly complex as the 6 seasons of the popular television period drama Downton Abbey. Thus, for example, there is bias against Annie Besant's theosophical teachings within the theosophical movement itself. When the TS experienced its first major schism in 1895-96, much of the American section of the organization split off from the so-called parent organization in Adyar, in part over Besant's frequent vilification in print of the American section's leader, William Quan Judge. Further fragmentation followed, resulting in such organizations as the Theosophical Society Point Loma, the Temple of the People, the United Lodge of Theosophists. These organizations have traditionally been highly critical of Besant's teachings, calling them pejoratively neo-theosophy. They study only the works of Blavatsky, Judge, and prominent leaders of their own, such as Robert Crosby and Gottfried de Puraker. Such divisions have created a complex tapestry of insider-outsider dynamics about which the prospective researcher must develop awareness, sensitivity, and a balanced perspective in order not to perpetuate unintentionally their respective biases. Even within the so-called parent body, now known as the Theosophical Society Adyar, there are differences of opinion about the validity and usefulness of Besant's teachings. Her history as leader of the Esoteric School of Theosophy, or ES, founded by Madame Blavatsky in 1888, created another level of insider-outsider dynamics based on secret teachings available only to ES members. Such members were recruited from the ranks of the TS and were required to belong to both organizations, thereby establishing an elite. During Besant's tenure as international president of the Adyar TS, members of this elite often received preferential treatment as organizers and administrators of TS affairs who were willing and even pledged to realize her agenda without question. The ES still exists, and its archives and publications remain off-limits to non-members. Historians within the movement, such as Leslie Price, have been outspoken about the ES's lack of transparency, even about major historical events of over a century ago. That's a quotation from Leslie. Indeed, it could be argued that an unbiased portrait of Besant's work within the Theosophical movement is impossible until ES records of her travels, policies, and teachings within the organization have been released. We now come to the problem of access to resources, lack of access to resources, which could be voluntary in the case of researchers such as Taylor, who are not interested in informing themselves deeply about the Theosophical movement, or involuntary in the case of researchers who do not know where to look for the material they require. For example, to document the history of the movement itself in an unbiased way, dozens of international and regional journals from theosophical groups of every stripe might need to be consulted, many of them rare, located in out-of-the-way archives, and sadly incomplete. A circle of academics and independent scholars who regularly share information and resources has developed in connection with the journal Theosophical History, edited since 1990 by Dr. James Santucci. Furthermore, several researchers and archivists within the Theosophical movement, non-sectarian members of its various branches, have also developed into an informal network with similar purposes. This network constantly refers questions from academic researchers to each other while pursuing their own historical investigations, acting as a neutral interface between members and non-members of the TS while maintaining the highest standards of scholarship. They are, in effect, insiders who can adopt the perspective of outsiders and thus may become invaluable informants, to use the anthropological term, about the history of the movement. The present conference is an attempt to demonstrate the value of collaboration between these intramural scholars and extramural academic researchers, or to flip the insider-outsider dynamic between intramural academic scholars and extramural members of the TS. Another manifestation of the possibilities of collaboration across this divide is the Friends of Theosophical Archives, FOTA, whose digital newsletter, edited by Erica Georgiades, documents the latest preservation projects, research problems, and archival findings. Academic scholars and TS member scholars each have an interest in the preservation of valuable archival resources, ephemeral in nature and all too prone to disappear as TS members age and pass on and branches downsize or disappear. I invite all in attendance here to consider supporting FOTA by membership or donation. Thus, my second call to mindfulness with respect to avoiding academic bias in the study of Annie Besant and her theosophical activities is to suggest that collaboration across the insider-outsider line may act to accelerate research, produce finely nuanced portrayals of TS history, such as Joy Dixon's, and act as a corrective to previous studies that may have been under-resourced or over-hasty. Let us now deal with the third item on our list of potential causes of academic bias toward Besant's theosophical work, eclipsed by male counterparts. One thinks of Charles Bradlaugh during the period of Besant's work in the National Secular Society and of George Bernard Shaw during that of her membership in the Fabian Society. As noted, Pecquestang-Boisier hints at the cause of this eclipse when she accuses Nethercott and Taylor of gender bias and prejudice against Besant's theosophical beliefs. Yet these writers are merely carrying forward a campaign of active suppression of Besant's views that waged during her lifetime, often fomented by male commentators in the press. One weapon of these critics was the word conversion, implying, as noted, weakness, instability, indecisiveness, and neatly fitting into socially accepted, male-dominated, misogynist views of women who threatened male hegemony. Another more subtle method, often used against Besant, was the accusation of not having a sense of humor, the implication being that she was a fanatic and therefore not worthy of consideration. Thus her work and ideas were conveniently wiped away, both during her day and after. We can see an example of this weapon in operation in an account by Charles Frederick Kenyon, a journalist and musician who wrote under the name Gerald Cumberland. In his 1919 memoir, Set Down in Malice, Kenyon Cumberland described an interview with Besant in Manchester. The date was not specified, but given that Besant was unable to travel in England between 1914 and 1919, the interview must have taken place before the First World War. Right from the beginning of his portrayal of Besant, Kenyon coaches his readers to perceive her as a fanatic. Mrs. Annie Besant like her Himalayan Mahatmas, is lofty, remote, and difficult of access. Only once was I admitted to the presence. Kenyon proceeds to describe members of the Theosophical Society as grotesque. The men had dyspepsia and bald heads, and the women wore jibbas and a look of condescending benevolence. They read Madame Blavatsky assiduously and gabbled nonsense to each other. Remember, this is from a book called Set Down in Malice. You understand the title now. Kenyon grants that during the interview, Besant seemed businesslike, but he adds that her pale face, surmounted by perfectly white hair, was of an intensely serious cast, and I saw no humor in her eye. There are a few worse points that unfortunately I wasn't able to include in the time that I have, so if you're interested in seeing the rest of the paper, please email me. George Bernard Shaw seems to have been a major perpetuator of the myth that Besant had no sense of humor. His remarks in connection with the 50-year anniversary celebration of Besant's work for humanity are frequently quoted. And I understand this was actually from a Theosophist article from 1917. I'll have to look that up. I wasn't aware of the earlier reference. Comedy was not her clue to life. She had a healthy sense of fun, but no truth came to her first as a joke. Injustice, waste, and the defeat of noble aspirations did not revolt her by way of irony and paradox. They stirred her to direct and powerful indignation and to active resistance. Now, the Fabian vein was largely the vein of comedy, and its conscience a sense of irony. We laughed at socialism, and we laughed at ourselves a good deal. Note the subtle pointing away from the direct and powerful indignation and active resistance of the fanatic toward the jokey, clubby atmosphere that was a comfortable fit for late 19th and early 20th century English males, even revolutionaries such as Shaw. However subtle were these remarks, published in 1917, I have 1924 here, the damage was done. In his 1928 biography of Besant, Geoffrey West claimed, "I am neither a theosophist nor an anti-theosophist, nor, it is sufficiently relevant to add, attached even remotely to any religious or political organization. Furthermore, if I have added interpretation or estimate, that has purely been in an effort to aid understanding and restore proportion." Yet his interpretation or estimate is heavily influenced by Shaw, whom he frequently quotes, directly and indirectly, sometimes I think almost plagiaristically, including Shaw's remarks on Besant's sense of humor. And we should not be surprised that the subject comes up again in Nethercott's biography of Besant, since he was, after all, a Shavian scholar. In the 1930s, the American actress and suffragette Elizabeth Robins, who we heard from Dr. Muriel, who worked in England and starred in several of Shaw's plays, wrote an unpublished biography of Besant, whom she had met on several occasions. Robins attempted to call out Shaw on his misogynistic remarks about Besant's sense of humor. Sorry, I can't read this in a female voice. Pace, Mr. Shaw, if Annie Besant had a sense of humor, she would not have been able to work with men as effectually as she did. The mass of men do not take kindly to humor in women. It may for the moment amuse them, but it makes them uneasy, puts them off the main track, and Annie Besant was all for the main track. By the way, we did have this is Shaw, and then Elizabeth Robins. So, this statement accords with Kenyon's description of Besant as businesslike. Thus it appears that Besant was so devoted to her spiritual work for the TS and her political work for India that she rarely had time for humor. That Besant did indeed have a healthy sense of fun, as Shaw admitted, and could even laugh at herself, as Shaw implied she could not, is demonstrated by the following remarks made in 1929 when Besant was 82 years old. "I am one of those who believe in religious poverty. I don't hold things as belonging to myself. Well, I wear certain clothes. I was told one day by an Indian ascetic that until I walked about naked, I couldn't call myself a spiritual person. I said I thought I would leave that for another incarnation." Thus, my third call to mindfulness concerns once again the insider-outsider dynamic. If we are tempted to think of outsider objects of historical research as fanatics, then perhaps we have not sufficiently understood the values that drive them and have not sufficiently called into question the neutrality of our perspective. If Besant can travel 37,176 miles in 7 months' time in the service of a cause she truly believed in, we could just as well admire her for her devotion as excoriate her for misguided fanaticism. However, as historians, we should do neither, lest we perpetuate the same biased insider-outsider dialectic in which our investigative subjects are embedded. That said, it is certainly possible for us to be amazed at the actions of gifted individuals such as Besant, who outperform all reasonable expectations of what a man or woman could achieve within life, especially in advanced old age. Such amazement does not commit us to an insider or outsider view and allows our readers to decide for themselves where to land on the continuum of approval that extends from celebration to condemnation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, really, I'm sure there'll be some questions. I just wanted to say, because you quoted some academics, I actually sent emails to a number of the academics I quoted as secondary sources, and both Joey Dixon and Karen Henry Mackey answered, and both of them sent their best for the conference, very kindly. Nethercott passed away, so I couldn't send an email to him. And I did not dare send an email to Anne Taylor, but I think you contacted her a few years back.
Yes, I had forgotten. Because yes, indeed, that was a very quick exchange. And
yeah, and she said
you had changed subject.
She didn't want to have anything else to do with Annie Besant anywhere. That was over. That's it.
Well, I guess for some people there is sometimes nothing more to learn.
Which is definitely not the feeling I have
about
now.
Annie Besant.
Yeah. Oh
no.
So, are there any questions? Yes, Leslie.
That was a landmark paper, and I hope it very soon sees publication in a very widespread way. An irony, if John Bernashaw would admit a bit of irony, an irony about the criticisms to which Annie Besant has been subjected is that sometimes the critics themselves fall into the traps that they attribute to Annie Besant. And Arthur Nethercott is an example of this. Perhaps he thought of himself as a shrewd historian, not seduced by Theosophy and silly things like that. But there's one thing that he didn't realise, and that was that the official life of C.W. Leadbeater was not valid. He seems to have accepted it at face value, which is so ironic. The hard-nosed biographer, for some reason, didn't inquire deeply into the official view of the life of perhaps Annie Besant's closest co-worker. But Arthur Nethercott lived to know better, because he was one of the referees of the doctorate, the thesis of Gregory Tillett. And he lived to see a much younger scholar, as so often happens, discover that things were not as they seem, because as we know, Greg Tillett discovered and explained in his book, The Elder Brother, that Leadbeater's birth certificate showed that he was born in 1854 and not 1847. And once that came to light, the whole house of cards about Leadbeater's early life came into question. So, and this happens quite often. Those who pose as sceptical authorities and wiser than those who have been led astray by this or that belief system themselves are not quite as sceptical and as scholarly as they may present themselves.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie.
And it's a lesson we should all remember. Really.
The context of that remark, in particular, in the easiest to relate instance, is Leadbeater claimed to have been born in 1847, the same year as Annie Besant, but it was discovered by Greg Tillett that it was actually 1854. But that was only one of the fabrications. I'm not sure that Nethercott quite would have believed the story of leadbeater in Brazil controlling a train at 11 years old in order to save his younger brother, who may never have existed, from attack by Indians. So.
Thank you, Kurt. That was superb. I concur with all that. As someone who has been a member of this society for many years, and mine claims occasional academic employment, I was delighted that the new international president has a spirit of openness. It's actually very interesting that in connection with this building, none of the people concerned are, in fact, I think none of the people concerned are still alive. I was on very good relationships with the then national president, who was then called General Secretary, about looking at archival material here. A few years later, this was just the membership ledgers, which are interesting. A few years later, when I inquired, and a subsequent holder of the office said, no such information exists anymore. And being a polite and well-brought-up person, I said, if you open the cupboard over there, but I didn't, and was told that, and if they did, the law said the Data Protection Act, which of course doesn't apply to archives anyway, to paper archives, that if it did exist, they wouldn't get it out to people. I don't know why, because I was both academically respectable but also a member of the society. And of course now, saner councils prevail. And it's a fascinating thing with this, that I think for some it was a fear of scandal, and the other was the suggestion which it made to me, is that the business of casting pearls before swine. And one has to go through a number of initiations of whatever that might mean in this life before you're, as it were, you're ready to receive these holy texts. A tradition that, as you know, existed in all sorts of traditions. But I think one of the fruits now of the topic being more academically respectable, certainly the university I've now retired from teaching in, but have taught in, welcomed me when they were introduced to me with open arms. They said, you know something about this topic, we're conscious of what we don't know. So I'm speaking of the study of religions in England and in Europe, by association, and I think to a great extent in America. And it's actually very interesting as time goes by how attitudes do change. But I think just to concur with Leslie that was a masterly summary of these things. So thank you.
Thank you. I just have just a little comment to add on to that. If you study the history of any kind of organization, but especially a spiritual organization like the Theosophical Society, you'll find that over time, as its the initial founders and the subsequent generations that were so enthusiastic begin to pass on, there's a sort of identity crisis. There's a question of what are the official teachings, but also in line with this idea of the insider-outsider aspect, there's a question of who are we as insiders? And I think the unfortunate thing that often happens is the insiders define themselves on the basis of deciding quite arbitrarily who they will allow in, either as members or as researchers. And if the word is to get out about the existence of something like the Theosophical Society and its history and its teachings, that's exactly the opposite direction to go in. So.
Yes. Unless there is another question, I'm going to move on to my closing remarks, but I think we can...
Thank you.